Howdy, Dr. Mark Keuthan here, and I'm going to try and stay on here long enough to try and explain something that's pretty complicated, but it's important. And if I can get it out and explain it orally, it'll make more sense, I think, when I start to write it down. So here we go. Many years ago by now, I read and got a hold of an essay by Dr. Thomas Parham called, the name of the article was "Why Do Heathens Make the Best Christian Films?" or something like that. That's pretty close. But it got me to thinking. I was already teaching at the collegiate level, at the master's level actually, in film and television, screenwriting, animation. I was teaching all of that. And it had long been a conversation between people who were teaching in the field that this was a true thing. This was a question that a lot of people were asking was, why? Why was it that people who didn't profess to be Christians were making better Christian films or redemptive films than Christians were? And so I've spent the last several years trying to answer the question. And I think I finally come up with the answer. And it's not an easy answer. It's not a quick to explain answer, but it's based on a lot of study of the history of story and storytelling and storytellers. It's based on the science of what happens in the brain, in the body, in the mind when storytellers tell a story and when people receive a story. There's also a fair amount of guesswork involved because the procedure hasn't changed that much. So let's set it up this way. Let's pretend that you are one of my students and you want to become a skilled, effective storyteller. Okay, you come into our program and we want to try and prepare you to do that by showing you all the things that I explained, which is, where did story come from? And where does it happen now? How does it happen now? What is this thing called story anyway? And so this is how I think we're going to try and figure it out. Let's add to this that I'm a believer myself. I am a Christian, so I want to get this figured out. I want to find out how Christians can tell skilled, artful stories like the rest of the industry does. I don't want us to be insulted or lambasted anymore for being less than artful in this fantastic art form. So let's start with a thesis statement. Part of what I've arrived at by looking at this is that we all understand as human beings that story is the most powerful form of communication ever in the history of humankind. There has never been any other method of communicating so much between humans, among humans, and because I'm a believer, between God and mankind. And so, I mean, even Jesus himself, his selected, chosen form of communication was to tell stories, parables. And so you have to come under the understanding that this is the most powerful form of communication in the universe. So let's start with that. Okay? So, a look at history. The history of how human beings have developed story and storytelling and this art form called story. You look at it, you look and see what has happened over history. All right, so I'm going to go all the, so if you look at history, and here's the framework for what I'm talking about. Go back to the objective that we're going to try and turn you into a storyteller if you want to become one. You need to understand what story is, where it came from, its history, and therefore you'll discover its process, the process of becoming a storyteller. And it's still being done the same way. It's whether you want to become just an oral storyteller, that is, you just tell stories, you want to go to a story festival, and you want to tell stories, how you get good at that is the beginning of the method. Then if you say to yourself, now I really want to be a writer of good stories. A writer of good stories. Okay, you still have to go through the historical process that's been in place for millennia upon millennia, starting with the oral tradition and learning to say stories out loud, and then progressing to, okay, now we're going to write it down. All right, you get to the writing down part, and as you well know, there's so much to learn. So in the history of mankind, we eventually got to written language. It was oral language for a long time. Nobody was writing anything down, and then eventually people started writing things down. We developed the technology, something to write with. We developed a language with letters or symbols of some kind, and strung symbols together to create words into sentences and so forth. And so now we have written language. That means you don't have to memorize long Homeric poems or Beowulf, 4,000 lines, however long that thing is. And now you can write it down. And so now the brain does something very different when you want to write a story. You still need to develop it orally, even if it's in your mind, before it can be effectively written down. And then as time went on, we came to the next phase of storytelling, and that is what I'm going to call the visoral, visual and oral, visual and oral method of seeing things like on a screen, which now we're getting to the written version of that as a screenplay. And so you have to have the ability to take your oral tradition capabilities and translate them to written form, and then you take that written form and you turn it into a form of written form that can be translated yet again to the screen. All right, there it is. There's the process. If you would like to become a great storyteller, whether we're talking Shakespeare, Charles Dickens, Steven Spielberg, on and on and on and on, any of these people, you're going to have to go through, at least mentally, this historic process that humans have been doing for millennia upon millennia to be able to get to. The problem with a lot of people these days, especially a lot of my students, is they want to shortchange the process. They want to skip over the oral part. Let me give you an example of how it works really well in today's, and that's animators. Go on YouTube sometime or any place on the internet and find the videos that explain how professional animators at Pixar, Disney, DreamWorks, any of those people, how do they develop an animated film, especially a feature film? Well, any of them. And it's the process the same. They start orally. It's called the pitch. And they get a whole bunch of people together, and the director and the producers, and they go, what if we did this? And you tell the story. You tell the story orally. And if it gets a reaction, and maybe other people jump in, and they go, yeah, but what if we did this? You know, and maybe we have toys that talk. Yeah, oh yeah, you know, I used to have a slinky dog. That would be great. And oh yeah, we have to have Potato Head. You see what I'm doing? We're working it out orally. And as you do that, you begin to see it in your head. Cinematically, it begins to play in your head. And so over time, animators have to take a long period of time to do this because they're drawing out, at least in this day and age with a computer, every single frame. So nothing is shot, it all has to be created. You have to create every blade of grass, every facial expression, every article of clothing, everything on the screen is created meticulously, and so that takes a long time. And so because the process of creating stories in animation takes a long time, it slows down the story creation process, and it makes it possible for it to gestate and to make sense in the head, and for new ideas to come. And see, this is the ancient oral tradition. Let's say that you live several thousand years ago, And we could be in any number of different cultures in the world. Chinese, Celtic, we could be anywhere. We could be Russia, we could be thousands of years ago. In any culture that you wanted, you have your storytellers. You have your people who are the purveyors, the holders, the maintainers of history, cultural values, great stories, legends, myths. They all have to learn them. And because it's important that everybody in the culture know these stories, you have to learn them, you have to learn how to tell them. Well, that's not a quick thing. So you have the master storyteller who tells these stories, and you have the up-and-coming storytellers, and they have to practice it and try it again and fix it and think about it and try it again and again and again and again and again. So it's not memorized. You're not memorizing 4,000 lines of the Odyssey, the Iliad, or Beowulf. You're learning it. You're learning it episodically. So there's some science involved here. What your brain does when it learns a story is it's visual. It's internally visual and oral. It's sensory. There's smells. There's life experiences that get into this. And so the up and coming new crop of storytellers come through, and they put their little tiny spin on it. They're not going to tell the same story the same way again and again and again. It's going to change and alter and grow and get changed a little bit, and it will not be exactly the same as the guy you're learning it from. It shouldn't be. It's not supposed to be. And so the process gestates mentally in your head, and you want to try and form it, mold it into the best possible form it can be. And part of what molds it is an audience. An in-person audience. You'll learn this from people who do stage plays. I've done a number of stage plays myself, and one of the ones that really gets you is if you ever have a chance to do Shakespeare. Shakespeare, because you're not allowed to change the words at all. Shakespeare words are sacred. You don't change them. So what you have to do, though, is that you take these long-standing words and you form a character in your head, and of course physically and vocally, and so you rehearse, you learn the words, you do memorize the words, but you learn the character. You adopt the character. You try and, in the method acting, thank you, Alan Rickman, we think character thoughts. We become the character. You're no longer somebody else. Is made fun of wonderfully in Nicholas Nickleby and Nathan Lane. Anyway, the point is, a good actor will tell you that you don't really form the character until you get it in front of somebody. You get it in front of a live audience and a paying audience, not rehearsals, and their reactions to your part in the storytelling will help to shape it. So let's say that you're doing the same play with the same lines for 6 weeks. I guarantee you will have formed the character differently by week 6 than it was in week 1. It's unavoidable, and it's necessary. The same thought process and concept goes into you needing to work through a story that you want to work on. Just like these ancient storytellers, you practice it. So this is the first step in the process. Let's say that you have a story in mind. You haven't written anything down yet. Let's say that you have a story in mind that you want to tell. I recommend, because this is the way ancient storytellers have been doing it for a long time, and animators are still doing this. You try it out. You think it through, and maybe you turn on just your video camera, you just throw it up on YouTube, and you try telling the story. Once upon a time, a little girl found a tree in the forest, and she sat under it and looked upward through the dappled sunshine and listened to the breeze flutter the leaves. All right? Man, you're in. Boom, I just tried that right off the top. I didn't pre-think that. I didn't plan it. I didn't write anything down. I just got started. And so if you tell a short little story and you throw it out there and you see what happens, you're going to get some feedback. Hopefully you get some feedback, honest feedback, and you'll rethink it yourself. You'll replay it. You may watch the video again, and you may go to yourself, you may say to yourself, I need to change it here. I need to, maybe a different accent. Maybe it needs to be done with a, southern, sort of a Texas accent, kind of a dadgum. This little girl, she came running up to this tree. She sat down underneath it. She looked up at the sunshine and she thought, man, this is fantastic. See what I did? I changed it. I changed a lot of things about it. It's the same story. It's even the same number of events. It's even the same location. But it got changed. And that's part of the process. This process of you trying it out, thinking it through. Notice we still haven't written anything down. That's important. This is all supposed to be mental, because what your brain does when it tells a story is it forms your thinking episodically. If you are telling a long story like Homer did with the Odyssey and the Iliad, scholars believe that he memorized it or learned it by episode, and that he could see it in his mind. And as it was playing in his mind, this is what scholars say about oral tradition and storytelling. As it's playing in your mind, you're experiencing it in your mind. You know the story so well, you've worked on it so long, you've thought about it so much that the story is playing in your mind. So what you're doing is you're just telling an audience what you see, hear, feel, smell in your mind. And the skill necessary to do that well, you'll know whether it's working by watching an audience. And so part of this process is a triangular. Scholars tell us the triangular relationship between story, audience, and the teller, storyteller. People like Donald Hill, a professional storyteller, will tell you that the process of telling the story changes the storyteller. It's called transformation. And you hope that your story, as you're telling your story, also has a transformational process on your storytellers. Now, let me go with a little bit more of the science on this. There is, according to brain psychologists and medical doctors, is that story has the ability, a well-told story, as the Greeks would say, that send you through a catharsis, all of the emotions, everything from sadness, which is in a tragedy, to shock, which is in a horror story, to love, which is in a romance, and of course laughter, which is in a comedy, is all of those emotions release this cocktail of wonderful chemicals that make you feel good. And as you go through those different emotions by experiencing the story, as it's being told out loud to you, you're into it, you're immersed in it, you're there, you're experiencing the story with the teller. Then you get all those cocktails going in your being. You're getting adrenaline and epinephrine and dopamine and all these great little chemicals coursing through your veins that gives you a thrill and makes you feel good. And it's what story does. Nothing else does that. But story, it so comprehensively affects you, human beings. So this is phase one. You learn to tell a story orally. A story that you have in mind that you want to develop. Let's say that you want to become a storyteller. All right, you'd have to do this first, because that's what human beings have been doing for thousands of years. Thousands and thousands and thousands of years. You learn to tell a story out loud. I'm sure that you have people in your family who do this. Everybody has an Uncle Fred or an Aunt Lucy who, every time the family gets together, has stories. It may be the same 5 stories that they tell to you over and over again, but it's important. It may be the time that Uncle Fred and Aunt Lucy got married on a boat in the middle of the Yangtze River. Man, that's a story. And why is that important? Because it helps to form relationships and values in a family. And so the youngsters need to hear it. Now, what does that do? That teaches the youngsters that storytelling is important. You don't have to teach a kid how to tell stories. They're born with it. I mean, how many kids do you know that one of the first things they want to say to you out loud is, read to me, tell me a story? Every kid wants that. The favorite time in any school day, if they still have this, is story time. I'll never forget when I was in the 3rd grade, 1,000,000 years ago. My 3rd grade teacher, Mrs. Barrows, read to us The Singing Tree by Kate Sarity. Whoa! I'm more than 60 years old, and I remember that. That's because we all gathered around. There was a special rug on the floor, and all of us, and Mrs. Barrows would say, all right, story time. And I mean, it took 2 seconds for all of us little ankle biters to get on the carpet and go, okay. And she would tell us a chapter from that book. And we were spellbound. Every kid wants this. It's built into the human DNA. The genetic makeup of humans is to always want to be communicated to by stories. Again, this is evidenced by Jesus himself. We think maybe he preached one sermon, the Sermon on the Mount. But most of the time, he didn't wag the finger and say to the rich young ruler, you should be nice to your neighbors. You should be nice to them. That's what the priests would do. The Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes. No, Jesus said, who's your neighbor? Let me tell you a story. And everybody around him, come on, he's going to tell a story. We love Jesus stories. They're fantastic. And Jesus' stories communicated so much orally to people, we're still talking about them. Even if you've never cracked open the Bible, you know who the prodigal son is. You know who the Good Samaritan is. You know some tenets of the lost sheep, the lost coins. Why do we know that you still know about that? Because pieces, elements of that oral tradition still show up in stories we're telling today. Even the pagans are doing this. And you see what this did? This loops all the way back around to where I started. The Dr. Parham's essay. Why do pagans tell the best Christian stories? All right, let's move on to phase 2. So, you've got this story that you want to tell. You've done a good job of figuring out how to tell it orally. Now you want to see it written down. Okay, now we're going to move into, if we're talking about history, the history of storytelling and storytellers, now we're going to move into what we call the scribal tradition. So every great ruler had scribes. Persians, Greeks, Romans, all the great civilizations became great civilizations. Egyptians became great civilizations because they started to write things down. They developed a language, a written language, symbols, letters, language. And at first it was things like cuneiform and hieroglyphics. But eventually it became alphabets and so forth. And then you had this class of people whose job it was to learn this language and to write things down. And so that became the first way that there was recordings of stories and recordings of, so in the case of the Hebrews, that would be Moses. Moses was most likely one of the, traditionally, the writer of the first 5 books of the Bible, the Pentateuch, and so we know that he was educated in Egypt, so he knew language. He was a very, very smart guy, and at some point in his life, he began to write things down. And so one of the reasons we have the stories that are in the first 5 books of the Bible, Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, is that Moses wrote them down. And so we've got the scribal tradition. So you're writing things out. So my recommendation to you is, don't go quickly to the typewriter. Get a blank tablet of paper and a pencil or a pen. I actually like the gel pens. You know, they have the padded little grip right there, and they click, you know, and there's the gel ink in there. It glides very nicely out of the pen and onto the paper. It's very nice. Don't go immediately to a typewriter or to a computer. Why? Because that's the way it happened in history. It was a long time before we had type. Not until Gutenberg in 1440, did we have movable type. So it was much later, from the time that we had the scribal tradition, where people started writing things down by hand, until movable type, was a long time, several hundred years. And so that's where I suggest, because the mind, we're back to science again, the mind does something very interesting and different when you start to write things down by hand. It gives you time to think. You're forming words with your fingers. And you don't need to think about grammar. You don't need to think about where the punctuation goes. You just need to draft it. Get it out, written out. It can be messy, who cares? But the process of writing it down now translates the story you've been telling orally to written form. And again, that may take several versions. Now, don't lose the oral tradition, because what you want to do is you want to take what you've written and read it out loud. Telling stories should always, even if it's in print, have an oral feel to it. The reader should still feel like somebody is sitting in front of them telling them a story. That draws them in. That immerses them in your story. That gets them to believability. So, you've written the thing out by hand. I wonder how this goes. You read it out loud, and maybe you record it. Or maybe you tell your friends. Maybe you take them out for coffee, and you say, here, listen to this. And you read the story. Now, what will happen is, as you're reading the story, something magical happens when you hear something written out loud. You'll go, oh man, that doesn't sound right. I need to change that. Sound. Remember, we haven't lost the oral tradition here. We're just taking it to the next level. And so you get your pen and paper out and you start making notes, and this is why people who draft things longhand leave space in between. They don't cover every line. They leave space in between and space in the margins so they can make notes and draw arrows and let's move this to here, and I don't like the name of that character, let's try something else. And that's you doing that to you, but you also get feedback from whoever you want, feedback from whoever you're telling the story to. And so this is the next thing. So maybe you need to do this more than once. Maybe you need to draft the thing out by hand more than once. And you need to retell it out loud more than once. And eventually that will be the forming process. The thought process now forms new things. It forms more details, it forms different visions, it plays out in your head a bit differently. But now you also have people who are going to have it playing out differently in their head. All right, next step in the written tradition is, of course, to get it to a typewriter or to a computer, where you're going to put, your written version, your best written version, handwritten version, up here, and you're going to type it. Now, why do that? Because remember the triangle? The relationship between the story, the storyteller, and an audience. You still have to do that in the written version. You still need to get it out there and get feedback. You still need to have somebody say, there's the dog. Frappe, the pug. She's defending the property. Oh, yeah. Anyway, it's worth your while to type it out, and again, type it out double-spaced, say it out loud. Maybe now what you want to do is you want to self-publish. Throw it out there on Amazon Kindle. Why not? Apple iBooks. Why not? It's free. Let's see if you can get a much larger audience to respond to your story. Because what will happen is, as it did for people like Tolkien and Lewis, who got feedback on their printed works, they went, I need to change this. I need a British accent. I need to change this. It's not quite right, is it? So, again, so now you're going to try and perfect it in the written version over time with different versions of it. Rewrites, as the professionals say, people who write fiction all the time, the real writing is in the rewriting. It's never perfect the first time. Never. And I've talked to dozens and dozens of professional, successful fiction writers who have had lots of things published, and they all say the same thing. The writing is in the rewriting. Why? Because you're continuing the oral tradition, at least mentally, and maybe out loud to people who want to hear this, so that it's formed and formed and formed. I go back to our animators. Animators, when they have something they want to see if it really works, they make sketches, they make storyboards, and they put them up on the wall, and they come in with a pointer, and the person who has this part of the story to work out with everybody, they gather an audience, directors, producers, staff, other animators, and so forth, and they act it out. They do a little bit character voices, and they do story noises, you know, whooshes and cracks and slam doors and whatever, you know, or lightsabers, right? That's part of the deal. And you get a reaction, you get feedback, and you find out what's working and what isn't. And people will go, that's fantastic. Well, there we go. There's that cocktail of feel-good chemicals again going in you, the storyteller. There's nothing like it. Nothing like it at all. It's fantastic, right? So you come to the end of phase 2 of the storytelling process, and you have worked out the written part. But maybe that's not enough. Maybe you're the sort of storyteller that wants to get your story to the screen. That's phase 3. And again, the oral process, the oral storytelling is not abandoned. Now it becomes the pitch. Now you take your story, and now you need to translate it into visual oral images for a screen. That's a very different and much more complicated process. And I'm not going to take really the time to explain all that here, because that would take too long. But essentially what you're doing is you're taking the story that you've developed through 2 phases, and you're now going to shove it into the ultimate art form. That is things for the screen, which includes so much to make it all work. So it's not just a script. It's all that other stuff that goes with it. Let's say that you get a script finished and it gets bought or produced or whatever. Man, now you've got a whole bunch of people who are going to be part of the process. And now you have actors, and directors, and producers, and set designers, and yeah, on and on and on and on and on and on and on. And you shoot the thing, and see what we've done? We've looped all the way back around to the oral tradition again. And we're telling the story out loud again. And we're adding to it somebody's vision of the images and the sounds, sound design, cinematography. This is the aesthetics, the grammar of film, the film and television, and animation actually. And so we've come full circle. We come all the way back around. We started with just telling it out loud, the oral tradition, moved to the scribal tradition, moved to the print tradition, and now we're going to go to the visual tradition. And that's the whole thing. And I can prove that that's the way storytellers become storytellers, because I've looked at the science and the scholarship and the Bible and history. Okay, why am I telling you all this? Because we finally get back around to the answer to the question I posed from the essay originally, which is, why do heathens tell better Christian stories than Christians do? It's because, in my experience, in having taught Christians to try and become storytellers for film and television for many years, they don't go through the whole process. People in the industry do. People like Spielberg have gone through the whole process. People like Scorsese has really gone through the whole process. And I'm including actors in this too. The actors who are well known, people like Tom Hanks and Meryl Streep and Helen Mirren and all those people went through the whole process. They went through all phases of learning to become a storyteller before they got to film. They didn't shortchange that. And it's been my experience that if you have Christians making films, and the films turn out to be pretty shallow, empty, non-artistic, you haven't really created an impactful story like Jesus' parables. Why is that? It's because they don't understand and haven't gone through this whole process. I'd like to fix that. Now that I've got the answer to the question and have done all this research, I'd like to get it out there. I'd like to develop a program that gets the average person through all these phases, so that if you want to become a storyteller, even if you just want to understand storytelling, I think I can get you there. One last thing. All stories in the world point to, owe something to the story that's in Scripture, the Bible. If you look at the 66 books of the Bible as one giant story given from God to mankind, it's a collection of a lot of different stories, but see it as there's a through line through the whole thing. And that is God trying to communicate to mankind that He loves them, that He wants a relationship with them. And look, I've made a provision for all that. It's in the stories. And you link all of the stories together, and you get the story. And this is where we get to Tolkien and Lewis. J.R.R. Tolkien and C.S. Lewis figured this out. This is one of the things that I think is missing from the education of Christians who want to become storytellers. They don't look at Tolkien and Lewis. Tolkien, who was a great studier of myth and legend, and he was also a devout Catholic. He went to Mass almost every day, and you can tell from his letters he had a personal relationship with Christ. He wasn't just a practicing traditional Catholic. He knew God. And how do you know that? Because it shows up in his fiction, and it shows up in his essays. I challenge you to read On Fairy Stories. His whole explanation of how awe and wonder and mystical mystery, miraculous things happen around us all the time. Why? Because that's God. It's in the Bible, and so what he did was he said, well, then it needs to be in our fiction. It needs to be in our storytelling. God is a God of wonder and awe and amazement and things you can't explain. That should be a part of your storytelling. You should tell stories like Lord of the Rings. Did you go, what does that mean? See, you're going looking for answers. The guy who really wrote about it a bunch was C.S. Lewis. C.S. Lewis wrote a lot about myth, imagination, because Tolkien brought Lewis to Christianity through a study and a whole bunch of questions and answers about myth and legend. And famously, Lewis eventually said, oh, I get it. There's all these other myths and legends in the world that train us to get ready to take a look at the one myth in the world that's entirely true, and that's the gospel of Jesus Christ. Lewis looked at that and went, oh, okay. And he wrote about that and he explained that for the rest of his adult life. I challenge you to take a look at the nonfiction of C.S. Lewis, Miracles and Experiment and Criticism and Reflections on the Psalms, and there's Mere Christianity, of course. But let's not leave out G.K. Chesterton. Chesterton's chapter 4 in Orthodoxy, The Ethics of Elfland, he was before Lewis and Tolkien. All of these guys came to the same conclusion, and that is, the story needs to be looked at, studied, understood, emulated, and inform the stories we're learning how to tell. So, there it is. There's the explanation. There's the answer to Dr. Parham's question. What am I going to do about it? I'm going to try and help. I'm going to try and get this information out in an applicable format so that we as Christians can learn to be the best, the most impactful, the most amazing storytellers working today. Better than the heathens. All right? Will you come along? Let's get started.